Hello, welcome to another reading from the Scargatherer series. Saving the Unicorn's Horn, we're on still, book 2 in the Scargatherer series. For those of you who've just discovered this, which I know some of you might have done, we have already had it's in mirror image, the Leopard in the Golden Cage, which was the Roman story. So we had all of that, and if you've just discovered this channel, then this is the second book. You'll find all the chapters of this book on Facebook. I've also just spent ages this afternoon on YouTube faffing around to try and get all the videos. I've got all the Leopard in the Golden Cage videos onto YouTube, and I'm trying to make it so that you can actually find them. One of those things that just, it's not very rewarding, because you just have to put in lots of keywords and tags. And to begin with, it doesn't really change anything very much. But of course, if you do want people to find you, it has to be done. So there we are. I hope you've had a good day. It's cold, isn't it? I'm back in my wearable blanket because I'm feeling a bit chilly. We've done a bit of work today, quite a bit of work today, which is quite good, and had a cello lesson on Zoom. Much successful than the piano lesson on Zoom. I don't quite know why. I can't quite put my finger on it, but it seems to just work a bit better. I think it's to do with where the screen is, and funnily enough, my middle child is not good at talking to the camera. Even though he loves films and he loves things on screen, he's rubbish at talking to the camera, which is probably going to be something he's going to have to learn to do, because the new generation, the upcoming generation, my children's generation, are going to do everything on screen, I think, probably, so they need to be good at it. Anyway, we are on to chapter 12, I'm just adjusting the angle, of Saving the Unicorn's Horn. My mother pointed out to me that I was talking about it being bank holiday on Monday, and this is why I thought I'd go on and finish this rather than put it off till next week. And she pointed out that, of course, it's not bank holiday on Monday. I did know that, actually. It does say bank holiday next to Friday, next Friday on my calendar. But of course, it's just so immaterial, isn't it, to us all? We'd have otherwise had a bank holiday weekend and people get a day off, and I guess my husband won't work on Friday, and I won't make the kids do any schoolwork on Friday, but whether it's Friday or Monday really makes no difference at all, because we're all still stuck at home. But hey-ho, never mind. I will finish this anyway. So we're on chapter 12, so I'll finish this anyway on by Saturday, so that we have the whole thing. And then we'll start in on Monday with the next book in the series, which is this one, The Falconer's Quarry. Again, sorry about the mirror image, but yeah, we'll start that next week. I'll probably get to the end of it before we're all allowed out, and then I'll have to see what I do after that. So, chapter 12. Yes, Joe's back in his own time again. And, yeah, he's got back to his mum's house, and she's come into his room in the evening to say, "What is this piece of paper?" And she's held out a letter that he has typed to himself from Fishbourne Roman Palace, saying that they've found his St. Christopher and they're posting it back to him. Because, of course, Lucy gave it back, so suddenly he had it back, and he had to account for why he had it. And he thought the printer didn't work, so he printed it twice. And then, of course, there turns out to have been a copy down the back of the printer. Now Mum says, "Come to that," she was looking at his neck, "where is your St. Christopher now?" Chapter 12. Joe felt colour flood into his face. He turned away quickly and bent down to put his shoes straight while he tried to think what to say. Lying made him deeply uncomfortable, especially lying to Mum. It was something that she and Dad had always been really strict about, and until he started time travelling, he'd had no trouble sticking to the truth most of the time. But there was no way he could tell her what had actually happened to his St. Christopher. "I wrote the letter from Fishbourne," he said, hanging his head. "I found the St. Christopher caught up inside my clothes when we got home that day. I thought you'd be cross, so I made up that letter and pretended to send it back. I didn't know the printer had done 2 copies. Mum frowned. But that was weeks after we went there. You'd started back at school. Why did you wait so long? Sam said Dad gave you grief over losing it when you were staying with him. If you had it all the time, why didn't you tell him so? I don't know. Joe stared at the carpet. And where is it now? Now? He didn't look at her. If he said it was in one of his pockets, or he hadn't yet unpacked it from his luggage, she'd want him to find it and show it to her. Then he had a brainwave. I fainted on York Station, and the chain got broken. Dad took it away with him to get a new one. You fainted? He didn't mention that. Joe was relieved to see he'd distracted her from the original question. He really ought to have said something. She sounded annoyed. It was nothing, Joe said hastily. I didn't eat enough breakfast, and then I stood up too quickly. I'm fine, really. He probably didn't want to worry you. I'd still prefer to know. Has it happened before? No, it was just a silly thing, honestly. It's fine, really it is. He tried to think of a way of changing the subject. Can I go to the library tomorrow? She shook her head. It's closed on Sundays. Why? What did you want to look at? Nothing much, he shrugged. We went to the Vikings Centre in York, that's all. It was sort of interesting. Mum stood up. So we're on to Vikings now, are we? I'm glad we're moving through history in chronological order. She smiled and stroked his hair. Go and clean your teeth. I'll be up again in a bit to say good-night. She went off downstairs. Since he couldn't go to the library, Joe spent over an hour the following day searching the internet for anything about the King of York's burial. He'd found the right king, he was fairly sure, a man who the Vikings called Sigtryggur had been King of Dublin and then King of York, and had died sometime in 927. There was even something about him becoming a Christian, and then changing his mind, like Lucy had said. But there was nothing about his burial. Joe was sure Lockie had mentioned Staddlethorpe, and Thorpe did seem to be a part of Viking place names. But there wasn't a place with that name any more, only a road called Staddlethorpe Broad Lane. He peered at the map. It did lead down to the River Ouse, just at the point where it narrowed, like Lockie had said, so perhaps that was the spot. Even if it was, though, he couldn't find anything about a Viking ship burial nearby. There were only 3 altogether for the whole of Britain, 2 in Scotland and 1 on the Isle of Man. Joe was puzzled. Perhaps Lockie had been wrong, and Sigtryggur hadn't been given a ship burial after all. After school on Monday, he went to the library and borrowed all the books he could find on Vikings. He knew that if he couldn't find anything on the internet, there wasn't likely to be anything in the books. But there might be other things that would be useful to know when he got back to, if he got back to Lucy's time again. A lot of the books focused on battles and voyages, however, and most of the rest were about stuff he already knew. The only bits that were new were explanations of things he'd come across while he was there. Ice skates were made of bone, he found, and the bread was gritty because it had tiny specks of rock in it from the stones used to grind the flour. There was something about unicorn horns too. They were actually the tusk of a kind of whale called a narwhal. So Lucy's grandfather had probably caught a narwhal himself and sawn its horn off, and then lied about it, or he'd bought it from someone else who had done just that. Joe found himself strangely irritated that Lucy should have been taken in so completely. All in all, he felt rather grumpy. He tried, as he'd often done before, to forget all about Lucy's time. But over the next 2 weeks he found it hard to concentrate. It seemed that no matter what he was doing, whether it was working on a comprehension exercise for homework or splashing along muddy tracks for cross-country, a part of his brain was imagining Lucy and the others making their preparations for the king's burial. The big event, whatever it was would all be over by the time he went back, if he actually managed to get back again. It was hard not to feel he was missing out. "Mum says you've been looking at stuff about Vikings," Dad said, when Joe and Sam went to stay with him for the weekend again. "I'm glad the Jorvik Centre inspired you." Joe smiled politely. He couldn't very well say that it was more like thinking about somewhere you'd been on holiday and wondering what you would be doing if you were still there now. "You know, quite a lot of words we use every day come from the Vikings," Dad said. "Really common ones like want and get, and things like window and husband and egg." Joe nodded. He'd seen that in one of the library books. It was interesting in a way, but things like words and place names were just leftovers, clues for working out the past. He didn't need to do that because he'd seen it in real life. "I was wondering," Dad said, "is there anything you'd like to do this weekend relating to the Vikings?" No, not really." "Wilton isn't too far away," Dad persisted. "There was a famous battle there between the Vikings and the Anglo-Saxons. We could go and see whether there's anything to see." Joe tried to think of a nice way of refusing. "I don't think Sam would be very happy about that," he said. Dad grinned. "No, you're probably right there." So instead they played football in the park, went bowling and ate pizza while they watched a film. Joe didn't think about Lucy at all. On Monday morning he was sitting at his desk, listening to the teacher explaining how to do long division, when he heard a hissing sound. He looked around to see if anyone else could hear it, but the other children were looking at the numbers on the whiteboard, or staring out of the window, or fidgeting. Nobody else seemed to be hearing anything unusual. He stuck his finger in one ear and then the other, in case there was something blocking it, but the hissing just got louder. He shook his head, but it still didn't stop. He couldn't be about to slip into Lucy's time, surely, not in the middle of the classroom. He hadn't even been thinking about her particularly. But then he realised he'd been thinking about how impossible it had been to do long division in Roman numerals with her brother Petrus, and then thinking about the fact that in her new world Lucy didn't even know how many 1,000 was. A moment later, he nearly fell off his chair with dizziness. He closed his eyes and held on tightly to his desk. But his fingers grasped at thin air. The desk had gone. He took a deep breath and opened his eyes again. He was standing up, outside as far as he could tell, in darkness that was thicker and blacker than anything he had ever experienced at home. He stretched out one arm in front of him. His fingers were faint at the end of it, just pale shapes. Cold seized them. He tucked both his hands quickly inside his cloak and pulled it tight around him. From nearby came the gentle sound of water lapping. Beneath the stink of rubbish, he could smell the river. He knew from every other time he'd slipped back into Lucy's world that he must have reappeared in the same place as he'd disappeared. That meant he must be on the bank of the river, where Thorbjorn had taken him. Cautiously, he began to make his way towards the black humps of buildings away from the river. The ground was rough, and several times he stubbed his toes against rocks he couldn't see in the dark. Each time he hopped and rubbed his foot, then stumbled on, muttering rude words under his breath. Quite soon he reached the backs of the long yards behind the houses, and found the track that Thorbjorn had forced him down. Though it was gloomy between the fences, he found he could see better than he'd been able to a few minutes earlier. Either his eyes were getting used to the darkness, or it was closer to dawn than he'd thought. He walked up the track, doing his best to avoid the icy puddles in the ruts. He came to a crossroads and hesitated. He'd been about to cross straight over when Thorbjorn had caught hold of him. So to retrace his steps, he should turn left here, then right at the next junction, and then Coppergate would be on his left. He felt pleased with himself for remembering the way. Previously, all of Jorvik had looked much the same to him, but his brain seemed at last to be making sense of the town. At Lucy's house he hesitated again. A few shadowy figures had hurried by as he was walking, but he guessed it must still be extremely early. The household was probably fast asleep. He blew on his hands and shifted from foot to foot, wondering if there was a way to keep himself warm while he waited for dawn. Suddenly the door opened. Joe sprang back just in time to avoid having a bucket of dirty water slopped over him. "Joe?" He looked up. Lucy stood in the doorway with the now empty bucket. "Is that you?" she asked. "You're back. Where have you been? How did you know?" "How did I know what?" "We're leaving as soon as it's light. We thought we'd have to go without you." "Without me?" "Well, it would have been your own fault. If you wanted to come, you shouldn't have disappeared for 2 days. 2 days? He stared at her. "Would you stop repeating everything I say?" She was obviously exasperated, but she sounded excited too. "The burial is tonight, at Howden. It'll take us 4 hours, 5 if the road's bad. Father decided we should leave at dawn, so we have time to set up camp." "You mean the King of Jorvik's burial?" "Who else?" She stepped back into the house. "Do you want some breakfast? There's probably a little bit left in the pot." Joe followed her, still bewildered. "I haven't missed it then?" "No. Like I said, you're just in time to come with us. But I do wish you wouldn't keep disappearing like that." To Joe's surprise, it was a hive of activity in the main room of the house, as each person helped with the last preparations for the journey. "Look who I found on the street," Lucy called out. "Well, I never!" exclaimed Aileen. "Are you all right, Joe? We were worried about you when Pedder came back on his own." Joe grinned sheepishly. "It was Thorbjorn again," he said. "He grabbed me just after Lucy left me. Luishak," he corrected himself. "He dragged me down to the river and pulled his knife again." "But you got away." Lucy's eyes were gratifyingly wide. "Yes, but I didn't dare come back immediately." Lockie stopped what he was doing. "You should have done. We would have protected you." "I know. I'm sorry." Joe hung his head. "Never mind. You're here now. We'll add a bit to the provisions. I'm afraid I didn't make you a sword or shield, though. You'll have to use Pedder's old ones. Get them out, please, Pedder." "Thank you. Can I do anything to help?" Lockie put another loop of rope around the bundle he was tying up. "Eat something first, while Matthias brings the horse and cart round from the yard, and then you can help us load up." Joe guessed it was getting on for 2 hours later by the time they were finally on their way. Lockie had been chafing and fretting from the time it began to get light, but there seemed to be an incredible number of packages and parcels of all different sizes to be loaded onto the cart, including the great chest of clothes Aileen had opened last time Joe was there. And then each member of the family remembered something they had forgotten to pack, or something they had forgotten to do. Joe stood beside the horse, since he had no preparations of his own to make, watching them running in and out of the house. It was just like his own family getting ready to go away on their annual camping holiday. He smiled to himself before he remembered that there wouldn't be any more family holidays with Mum and Dad together. Finally, everything was loaded, and everyone had found a space somewhere. Joe wondered whether the horse would be able to move the cart at all, but at Lockie's flick of the reins it plodded forward a few steps. Coppergate was now thronging with people, however. Donkeys and ponies, and even goats were being loaded up, and those that were ready were edging towards the junction at the end of the track. Lockie steered their horse into the line, and they inched forward. Half an hour later, they still hadn't reached the city walls. Joe wriggled to try and get more comfortable. It was exactly like trying to get out of a car park after some big event, with hundreds of vehicles converging on one exit. So much for traffic jams being a modern invention, he thought. At last they were out of the city and into open country. Lockie sat up straight and flicked his birch switch against the horse's flank. The animal picked up speed and began to jog along the track which led south. In front of them, a line of horses and carts stretched out as far as Joe could see. To the left, he recognised the copse where he had collected wood with Lucy on his last visit. He turned to look back at the walls of Jorvik, rising up behind them like some kind of computer image from a film. Horses and carts were still streaming out through the gates in the city wall, down the track. He pinched himself. It was real. He was really here. "That took a lot longer than I hoped," Lockie called over his shoulder. "At least we're on our way now." "Along with the rest of the country, by the look of it," said Matthias. Joe looked at Lucy beside him. Her eyes were shining. "I'm glad you didn't miss it," she whispered. "I'm glad we didn't miss it either, because this means that we're going to be able to go to the ship burial. And actually, it's one of the pieces that I wrote in this whole series. So it's a 7-book series. I don't know, 7 lots of 16 or so chapters. This is one of the pieces I remember most vividly, is the experience of the Viking ship burial. I don't know why, it just stayed with me, and does still stay with me, even though it's years ago I wrote it now. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed that. I hope you will be back tomorrow for the ship burial. Don't miss it. And that's it for this evening. I was trying to think if there was anything else I was going to tell you. No, gone. There was something, but I can't remember what. Anyway, fish fingers and chips in this house tonight, because usually it would be swimming lessons. Of course it isn't, but we're still on the fish fingers and chips, so that's nice and easy. Hooray! See you tomorrow.